The year is 1998, and it's a big year for computer history. Google becomes a company in September. The first MP3 player, the Seihan MPMan, is released in Japan. Windows 98 is put out for the public to enjoy, a major and much beloved entry into the family of operating systems. And of course, two of the most unforgettable and important events in all of computing happened that year. USB 1.1 becomes a standard, and alongside it, the original iMac, a sleek, fast, family-friendly, and colorful machine, boasting specs fast enough to meet most any consumer application requirements, yet simple enough that it's as easy to use as a kitchen appliance. Plug in the power, plug in the keyboard and mouse, and just go. Of course, part of that simplicity came from its standardization. It ditched all prior serial port standards, including Apple's very own 80B, in favor of the faster, sleeker, and more efficient USB 1.1 standard, used for every single peripheral that could ever connect to the machine. It resulted in a machine that forced many companies in the electronics industry to follow suit, and that included makers of popular synthesizers. And so, roughly 9 months later, the very first sound module to ever support USB was unleashed upon the world, the Roland ED Sound Canvas SC-8850. It was perhaps not as much a successor to its previous model, the SC-88 Pro, as it was a specialized side grade aimed exclusively at desktop users, as made quite obvious by the ED or Eddie Roll branding, being the desktop media-focused subsidiary that Roland had launched a decade prior. Still though, there's a number of new features, sounds, and changes that make it worth looking at and discussing, so in today's video, we're going to take a detailed look at the 8850 and all that it has to offer, and perhaps convince some of you that it's still worth a spot in your home music studio. Let's take a look at it. Before we really delve into the looks and usage of the unit, let's have a basic look at all the features. The 8850 boasts 64-channel polytembrality when used over USB and 32 over serial or MIDI, 1,640 instrument patches with 64 drum kits, 64 fully customizable insertion effects, 8 types of reverb and chorus, and 10 types of delay, official General MIDI 2, and Roland GS compatibility, unofficial Yamaha XG compatibility, backwards compatibility of all prior Sound Canvas models, and stereo audio output at 24-bit 32kHz over RCA. It's a good improvement over the SC-88 Pro, but the improvements and changes don't stop there. One of the first things that is immediately noticeable upon looking at the 8850, if you're at all familiar with the other Sound Canvas models, is how radically different it looks. Abandoning the style that started with the SC-55 and was kept alive for 8 years with future models, the 8850 completely reinvents things, with the only thing that hasn't been changed being the volume knob, which is either the same part or very similar to that of the SC-88 and 88 Pro. Other than that though, totally different. Heck, even the color scheme is different. Roland's prior mainline desktop synthesizers, dating all the way back to the MT32, have gone for a more muted color scheme with blacks and grays and colors only used for highlights, with only the lower end budget products such as the CM series and the 55ST using beige and white color schemes. But the 8850 changes that by coloring the whole front panel silver, and the sides that you'll rarely see are a light metallic gray, which is more in line with earlier units. There are hints of black and gray here and there, with a majority of the buttons being colored as such, but for the most part, it's got a much brighter aesthetic all around. Whether or not you prefer that is all personal preference, but that combined with the rubbery buttons and the weird swervy appearance of the front panel gives this thing a much more friendly and less professional look that very much ties in with the machines it was aiming to work with, such as the iMac G3. The two absolutely look perfect together. It's like some sort of early 90s time capsule. Turning the unit over to the back reveals a variety of back things that you can plug things into. It's overall pretty similar to what's been included since the SC-88 though. On the bottom half, you get an RCA line input with volume knob to route audio from external synths into the 8850, 2 24-bit 32kHz stereo line outputs which can be set up in a few different ways, a big old sticker informing you of voltage the 8850 takes, and an AC input. The top half is where most of the action happens however, with 4 MIDI ports, 2 inputs, 2 outputs, allowing for a variety of synthesizer on cable action to occur, an RS-232C port for hooking up to computers that haven't adopted the brand new USB standard, and perhaps the biggest new feature, the USB port. Specifically, it's a USB Type-B connector, a fairly common type for musical equipment even to this day, so finding compatible cables is as easy as going on Amazon. And I'm sure some people, including myself, are dying to see what's on the inside of this thing, so let's crack it open and take a look. Getting inside isn't too different from the other SC models, it's just a couple screws away, and once those are all gone, we can take a look on the inside. There's a few ribbon cables that I don't want to mess with, obstructing your view a little bit, but we can still mostly see what's important here. On the inside, we can get a good look at the two CPUs. The first is a Mitsubishi M37-640E8, a microcontroller designed for the sole purpose of exchanging data between devices over USB. The next part is the actual CPU, a Hitachi SH-7605, which uses a Super H RISC-based SH2 core. That may sound familiar to some people into gaming, and that's because it's the same type of CPU used in the Sega Saturn, although not the exact same CPU. Next up, there's the all-important DAC, the AKM AK3324. This one was used quite a lot by Roland in the late 90s to early 2000s, being featured in the XP30, JV1010, XV5080, and possibly others. The last part really worth noting is the Boss MB87837, which give the 8850 its insertion effects. This is the exact same one that was used in the SC-88 Pro, which allows for perfect compatibility in that regard. The rest of the parts aren't anything too special. There's some SRAM for saving basic settings after a power off, 24 megabytes of flash memory used for storing demo musical phrases, sound synthesis information, and other things, 2 ROMs at 8 megabytes each for storing sample data, and a whole other bunch of bits and pieces that I have no clue what they do, so I'm a little scared to talk about them for fear of comments correcting me. So with the unit all put back together, it's time to set it up on the desk and see what it can do. The whole process of setting up the 8850 with a modern computer is as smooth and easy as it gets with a synth of this era. Just grab any regular polarized figure 8 power cable, some stereo RCA cables, and a USB Type-B connector, and you're on your merry way to hooking up the 8850. And that is, assuming you're using a computer that it's natively compatible with. As of making this video, the last update the 8850 USB driver received was to add Windows Vista 64-bit compatibility and support for Mac OS X 10.2 or later, which is very ambiguous, so I definitely can't comment on the modern day Mac compatibility, but I can say that getting this thing running on Windows 7 with barely any assistance was a total pain in the rear. A lot of people suggest to run the drivers in compatibility mode for Vista, but that did nothing for me, they just crashed upon starting. After about half an hour of messing around, I eventually ran into a forum post that suggested manually installing the drivers. You can do that by going to Device Manager after plugging in the 8850 and getting an error from Windows, finding the device, and pointing it to the driver files. If you're on Windows 8 or 10, however, then you may have to go out of your way to edit the driver files, disable driver verification, and install it that way, and it's just a gigantic pain in the butt. So, if you can't get the drivers to work on your PC or Mac, then your best bet is probably just to snag a good USB to MIDI converter, like a Roland UM series converter, which can be had for as little as $10 nowadays if you're lucky, but you can expect to pay $20 to $40 on average depending on the model and whether or not it's new. To be fair, this really isn't a fault of the 8850, the blame falls more so on Roland for not updating these drivers for a decade and not using a generic USB MIDI driver to handle these functions like Yamaha does, and instead having a separate one for every single device. Well, anyways, once you have everything booted up and ready to go, it's time to check out the user interface. And wow, going from an 88 Pro to this is quite the experience. Everything has been redone. Everything. One of the most notable changes is that the front panel no longer has any fixed or baked-in parts, so to speak. Taking a look at the SC-55 here, while it's off, you can see that there's a layer of graphics always there on the screen, and when we power the unit on, you can see that the front panel display is designed around this. There's only 2 parts you can draw onto, those being a 16:1 line for characters and a 16:16 field for sprite art. The SC-8850 made the switch to a 2.56:1 aspect ratio 164:64 dot matrix display, which is fully customizable and has nothing baked into it. Being a dot matrix display, one can draw anything to it anywhere, which gave Roland the ability to make some drastic overhauls to make things more intuitive. This also means you can do some neat full-screen pixel art if you have some sort of converter on hand, such as MIDI Movie Player by Mucho613, which takes MP4 files and spits them out as compatible sysx for the SC-8850. There is no understating how entertaining it is to watch videos on this. It's just so ridiculous, but I love it. The new screen and layout also brought upon a need for a different front panel. There's less buttons here than there were before, but each of them all serve a very important purpose. On the right side of the device is 2 sets of buttons, 9 buttons for accessing and using menus, and 3 buttons for things you can do anywhere. All of them are clearly labeled with their functions, and button combinations are hardly important now, so there's not too much of a need to read the manual other than for the occasional reference. But I imagine that the first thing most people are going to want to do is select some sounds and demo them. So to do that in the unit, just press the instrument button, select a basic sound, and then press the variation button to pick a variation. You can scroll through both of these using either the decrement and increment buttons, or by using the brand new jog dial, which is freaking amazing to have. Like, okay, I know I shouldn't be this excited over a dial of all things, but man, is it a seriously welcome change. Instrument selecting and value editing is no longer a matter of mashing buttons or holding them down until you get to the one sound that you want. Now you can fly through things at warp speed and get to what you want when you want it. Another great addition is the new sound previews. I mentioned before that the flash memory contains phrase previews, and, well, this is what I was referring to. There's 48 short, simple, but charming musical phrases to help you pick out instruments, and they work quite well for the most part. Although some of them sound kinda unfitting, like the harpsichord and celesta using the same phrase as the clav, and it was clearly designed around the clav. Yeah, that doesn't sound right. The variety of sounds here is quite stellar though, with somewhere around 1,000 unique sound samples, many taken from famous JV and SRJV products, and likely some original ones here too. You're bound to run into some sounds you recognize, some sounds you love, and some sounds you've never heard. It manages to cover the whole gamut of types, from great jazzy saxophones, rock and distortion guitars, to fun analog synth samples, and a great variety of ethnic instruments with 2 gamelan rhythm kits and a whole roster of Celtic instruments being some of the most noteworthy additions over the 88 Pro. Roland was also quite proud of some of the orchestral samples, such as the brand new strings, which I think still sound quite nice and are miles ahead of the earlier Sound Canvas models. There's also a lot of utility sounds that were previously lacking, such as more guitar fret sounds, breaths and clicks for woodwind instruments, and many more, so with proper programming, you can accomplish quite a lot here. It's also really easy to find whatever sounds you want, so as long as you know the general MIDI layout, being that the 8850 is based around that, with 128 basic GM tones and variations on all of those that can be selected either through bank select commands or by pressing the variation button and scrolling. You can also easily pick sounds from any prior model just by tapping the instrument map button if one of the new ones doesn't strike your fancy. Besides picking sounds and listening to them though, editing is another major part of the unit, and to do that, just press the edit button and bam, you're right in the menu. The way it's set up is that each of the free editing menus, which are sound edit, drum edit, and effects edit, have multiple sub-menus that you can select by using the function keys on the front of the unit. All of the effects like reverb, chorus, delay, vibrato envelopes, and filters can be accessed in just 1 or 2 clicks, and the more in-depth editing functions that were previously a total pain to change without a software editor on the 88 Pro, such as note fine-tuning and instrument pitch bend radius, are super easy to access here. And yeah, there is quite a bit that you can do here, as despite the perception that the 8850 and other Sound Canvas models are just bottom-of-the-barrel ROM players, they still have a lot of functions that aren't commonly acknowledged. The reverb and chorus effects are still quite nice to this day, and the cutoff and resonance filters allow for some pretty fantastic sound transformations, as well as some very cool effects when used correctly. And of course, you have the good old Boss Effects processor that sounds just as great as it did in the 88 Pro, with wonderful overdrives, distortions, choruses, delays, phasers, and many others, all of which are fully tweakable. Having all of these sounds and sound editing options doesn't mean much if you can't show them in any music though, so in order to best demonstrate the capabilities of the 8850, I'm going to play some music that I've created on it, along with some tunes from games, and some improv on a few instruments, and hopefully that'll give you a good idea of what to expect. The 8850 is still a blast to use and listen to when playing general MIDI or Roland GS music, and especially tunes made just for it. But how well does it handle music made for earlier sound canvas models? The answer is not half bad, but it could be better. Now there's two main things that affect backwards compatibility on this unit: the way the synth engine handles effects like cutoff and resonance, and the instrument mapping. The former is by far the biggest issue here. From what I understand, the 8850 has a newer synth engine based off of that of the 88 Pro, with some tweaks and changes likely to accommodate the completely new type of CPU since, as mentioned earlier, the 8850 is based on the Super H architecture rather than the H8 architecture of earlier Sound Canvas CPUs. Contrary to what a lot of people think, the Sound Canvas family does a lot more than just playback samples and software. The CPUs have to handle synthesizing sounds, mixing ones that use multiple samples, altering them with filters and envelopes, and other odd bits like the automatic legatoization of instruments like the violin. Porting all of that code, or really any large amount of code, from one architecture to another is almost always going to result in something going weird or not behaving as intended, and while keeping that in mind does make it easier to appreciate how accurate Roland was able to get the 8850, there's one major problem: handling the cutoff and resonance filters. Being some of the only features offered to the end user for synthesizing sounds, they're used pretty heavily for everything from EQing specific sounds to creating glitchy effects, and the way they're handled on the 8850 is... less than stellar at times, resulting in quite a few tunes that can sound garbled, although there is still a lot of music that doesn't use these effects, and some soundtracks, such as Ys Eternal's SC-88 tunes, sound just fine despite using them. And then there's the instrument mapping. The 8850 has received a lot of flack over the years for playing back music made for other Sound Canvas models incorrectly due to newer sounds replacing the original ones in the older instrument maps. And true enough, the instrument mapping here can be somewhat fiddly. SC-55 tunes range from passable with a few inconsistencies, like with some of Descent, to just completely wrong, like it's the case of the music that I did for the Death Wish mod for Blood. The SC-88 and SC-88 Pro maps tend to lean more on the good side of things, however. I brought up Ys Eternal just a moment ago, and I'm gonna bring it up again and use it as one example of how the 8850 can get things right. The game has a solid soundtrack for the SC-88 that primarily uses orchestral samples, which, combined with the great sound design and programming, makes for a wonderful score to go along with the fantastic game, and despite some occasional hiccups, the soundtrack plays mostly spot on with the SC-88 map here. That said, there's still a lot of inaccuracies that can crop up. Take a listen to my SC-88 cover of the old chiptune Vaxeen for You, for instance. Some instrument problems here aren't too bad, but then you get the things like the saw and it just completely falls apart. Now, another point of contention worth bringing up is the brand new DAC. Before I mention anything about how it compares to the older units, I want to play some audio samples comparing it against the 88 Pro so you can make your own judgments, then listen to my opinion second so as not to influence what you hear. The way I interpret it, the 8850 is a fair bit brighter than the 88 and 88 Pro, giving it an overall more pleasing sound to listen to. I asked some friends what their opinion was of it though, and I got about a 50-50 response, with some saying the 88 Pro sounded fuller, and others saying the 8850 had much better instrument separation. It seems to me that it's completely dependent on what your setup is and what your personal preferences with music are, but I'm going to say that I prefer the 8850 a lot over the 88 Pro. It's also worth bringing up the noise and volume levels. The 8850 can get mighty loud, though in general it seems like I have to turn it up more to get the same level of volume out of it compared to other sound canvas models, and it also has a little more background noise. It's not even close enough to being bad enough to be noticeable in a recording, but it's definitely still there. More on the software side of things though, the 8850 also lacks some features that prior models had. One thing that was neat on the 88 Pro, although perhaps not very useful for use as a desktop music device, was the patch mode that allowed you to pair multiple instruments together with an insertion effect to create a richer, unique sound. That's entirely gone here, although the practically useless user instrument mode from the 88 Pro returns, allowing you to customize an instrument with cutoff and resonance filters and save it to memory, which is basically pointless. Speaking of memory, that's another thing lacking here. The 8850 does not remember what settings it got before being powered off, as there's no battery backup, so if your power flickers or you forgot to save some setting to a MIDI file, you're completely screwed. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but still kinda confusing. Still though, with all that said, I don't think those downsides are enough to hold the 8850 back from being an excellent piece of gear that's just brimming with personality in every regard. There's so many adorable, nice little touches on the unit, like the pixel art that accompanies every instrument. I especially like the strings and slow strings art because you can move them back and forth really fast and make them swing along with some music, and that is infinitely entertaining to me. USB is another fantastic feature that I'm glad to have here. Between the lack of cable clutter and convenience it brings, it makes the device much more enjoyable to use and much easier to set up given you have a computer that'll actually work with it. It also makes sound stacking to create richer sounds much easier, as having 4 16-part ports removes any fear of running out of channels to use. And of course, there's the sounds! While it's not a gigantic improvement over the 88 Pro, the new sounds that were added here are really fantastic, and some of them, like the D50 Super Saw, are just super fun to play around with. The only thing that I think might hold the 8850 back for the average connoisseur of old music instruments is the price. Perhaps due to its status as the most advanced sound canvas, the quality of life improvements, or something else I'm not considering, the 8850 on average sells for about $250 to $300, a considerable amount more than the 88 Pro, which can be had for about $200. While I personally don't mind paying an extra $50 for the new sounds, USB functionality, better user interface, and nicer DAC, $100 does seem like a little bit too much to me. That said, if you're patient, you can still find some good deals on them. I paid about $120 for mine off of Reverb. It was beat up and listed as is, but I managed to clean it up, and the only thing wrong with it was that the headphone jack was seemingly abused by the last owner and it came in bent. I wasn't able to easily fix it by pushing it back in though, and attempting to take it off to examine it resulted in the solder pad breaking off. And of course, you gotta consider the alternatives available to the 8850, such as Sound Canvas VA, a VST retailing at $120 that seeks to recreate every major Sound Canvas revision in software. I did a collab with Woody's Piano Shack on this exact topic, so if you want to learn more about it, you can go there. It's also worth mentioning the lower end models as well, the 8820 and D70. Both of these make some pretty major changes, namely the removal of 36 instrument patches, a total overhaul of the compatibility modes, and changes to the interface and feature set. Neither of them feature the same lovely yellow and black two-color screens, swapping it out instead for some VU meters, and both of them really lean on the whole USB gimmick, but not in a bad way. The 8820 can be powered entirely via a standard USB port, removing the need for a separate power adapter, and while the SC-8850 still needs a power lead to plug into your wall, the USB port is used to provide both MIDI support and stereo 24-bit 48 kHz audio, as well as being capable of receiving audio sent by your operating system and taking in an external input via a front instrument plus microphone 1/4 inch input, turning this thing into a total audio interface. These models also tend to be cheaper on average and more in line with the cost of an 88 or 88 Pro, making them an absolute steal so as long as you have access to a program like GS Advanced Editor to do the programming, since, you know, there's no front panel to edit with. Still though, I wholeheartedly recommend picking up an SC-8850 or one of the related synths given a chance to get one at a good price. While I don't think the new features make it a necessary upgrade if you already own an 88 Pro, nor is it worth another $100, if one was given the chance to pick up either one at the same cost, I would probably push more towards the 8850. The wonderful expanded library of sounds, some of which are still very usable today, great user interface, plug-and-play nature, and inviting design, all add up to making the 8850 not only a wonderful send-off to the important and influential series of desktop synths, but a darned excellent musical tool as a whole that's well worth picking up if 90s synths and romplers are your kind of thing.